Hi class, so this week you watched two videos and participated in one online exercise based on understanding what capital and capitalism are, how capitalism works in our world right now, and the reality of wealth inequality in the United States. I want to spend this lecture summarizing some of the ideas from what you've watched and spend the remaining time discussing an idea not explicitly referenced in what you watched prior to this class lecture. So first I want to spend some time breaking down Piketty's Capital. That was the TED lecture that you watched, and I know that his ideas are incredibly advanced. He wrote a 700-page treatise called Capital in the 21st Century, and it's an incredibly important work in the economic world, but I'm certainly not expecting any of you to have read it or understand it completely. But this TED Talk gives a really good breakdown of the thesis or main argument of that work. So Piketty first makes sure that you understand how he perceives capital. So he perceives capital as wealth or assets that are held by private individuals, corporations, and governments that have the potential to be traded on the market. That means they are things like stocks, bonds, real estate, gold, and of course money. The U.S. economy functions on this sort of capital and its exchange. So the U.S. focuses on a form of capitalism. So this brings us to the role of capitalism within the United States. So capitalism is an economic system based on the idea that private ownership of the means of production is the best way to produce wealth, provide movement between the classes, and create economic growth and profit. It relies on those who produce, so that would be corporations, businesses, things like that, those who make the goods being produced, that's the workers, and the consumers. Those are the people that use the products that are being made. All of us are consumers in the United States, basically. Capitalism in the U.S. also relies on a permanent class of people who can make the goods being produced. It relies on class stratification. So capitalism could not exist without an upper, middle, and lower class. This is one of the most important aspects of capitalism, that you need to have the producing class, so that's the high class, and the working class, which is the people that make the things that we all consume. While private ownership is essential to capitalism, it is not the only economic system that values private ownership. This is something really important because a lot of the time in political punditry, they assume that capitalism is the only economic system in which private ownership is a part. That's simply false. Socialism, despite what you might hear on by certain news pundits, actually also values private ownership. It just thinks that private ownership is only for certain parts of society, that privatization should not necessarily occur on a statewide or countrywide level, and that there is value in having government-run commodities and businesses. But private ownership is still really important to socialism. There's also another economic system called distributism, which also focuses on the importance of private ownership. So don't confuse capitalism with the only economic system that values private ownership. So that's kind of how Piketty discusses capital and capitalism. So now we're going to move to another really important aspect of his argument, which is his formula, which is R is greater than G. So he discusses R as the rate of return. This is the change in value of wealth over time. He discusses G as economic growth, which is the change in value of an economy's overall productivity. The economy is going to be state-based, and when he says state, he doesn't mean the state like Arizona or California. He means like a country, a nation state. So that'd be like the United States, France, Germany, things like that. So Piketty's formula, R is greater than G, basically means that individual or corporation-based wealth is growing faster than the state economy. Piketty's assertion, so his argument, his thesis, is that because of this, wealth inequality is growing very quickly. So his basic assertion is that wealth inequality is a growing problem in the world because of the way that capital is functioning currently, which means that people who are already wealthy are accumulating wealth while economies aren't growing, which means that there's a permanent underclass of people who aren't being able to accumulate wealth in the way that capitalism says they should. So class mobility is an important part of capitalism, but what he's saying is that that's not actually happening. There are some critiques of Piketty's formula and his overall thesis, and this was largely discussed by Bill Gates in an article that he published last summer after the book came out. So he says that Piketty's formula doesn't take into account important aspects of economies based in capitalism. So, for example, while Gates agrees that some level of inequality is built into capitalism, the book doesn't, so the book is that big book, but that doesn't discuss if any level of inequality is acceptable and when inequality starts doing more harm than good. So Bill Gates is critiquing that Piketty doesn't discuss whether inequality in general is unacceptable, if there's a certain level of inequality that's acceptable, or if inequality sometimes does drive people to work harder and to strive for that class mobility that capitalism says that it thrives on. Bill Gates also says that Piketty's formula, that's the rate of return is greater than economic growth, R is greater than G, also doesn't account for the different kinds of capital and how the different kinds of capital have different social utility. So Bill Gates describes a problem like this. Imagine 3 types of wealthy people. One guy is putting his capital into building a business, another is a woman giving most of her wealth to charity, and another is mostly consuming for himself by buying things like a yacht and a plane. While it's true that the wealth of all 3 people is contributing to inequality, the first 2, so the man who's building a business and the woman who's giving most of her wealth to charity, are delivering more value to society than the third wealthy man who was just buying things like a plane and a yacht. Bill Gates also critiques Piketty by saying that there are forces that can lead to snowballing wealth, including the fact that the children of wealthy people often get access to networks that can help them land internships and jobs. But there are also forces that contribute to the decay of wealth that Piketty doesn't recognize and give enough weight to those forces that help decay wealth. Finally, Piketty focuses his data on wealth and income while neglecting consumption altogether. Consumption data represents the goods and services that people buy, like food, clothing, housing, education, and healthcare, and they give a lot of depth to our understanding of how people actually live in the everyday world. Particularly in rich societies, the income lens, so looking just at the income of people, which is how Piketty gathered his data, doesn't really give you a sense of what needs to be fixed in our current society. For example, one of the problems with this is that if you have a medical student who has lots of loans, maybe little or no income, that looks pretty awful with income statistics, even though that medical student has the potential for huge earnings in the future. And in another vein, you have a lot of wealthy people who might not actually work or have an actual income, but live off of stocks or other forms of income that aren't accounted for in the income statistics that Piketty used. So on both ends of the spectrum, it's just a problem that he doesn't use, that he only uses income statistics. But Bill Gates does say despite these critiques, Piketty does an excellent job of showing the very real state of inequality in the world, not just in the United States. The reason why I had you do the inequality.is exercise, so that website exercise, is because that shows that the US is not immune to this problem that Piketty is discussing, this growing inequality, that the gap between the rich and the poor, and the gap between the rich and the middle class, is growing exponentially in the United States. And Piketty's explanation of why that's happening is just one explanation of the growing inequality problem, but economists across the sector have discussed that this is a significant problem regardless of whether or not they've come to a consensus about where this problem originated. So that's Piketty in a nutshell. I also want to briefly discuss and introduce another concept, neoliberalism. So you might have heard me use this term, or perhaps other academics or popular pundits alike using this term, and I want to give you a bit of a better understanding of what it means and how people from different political and social perspectives use this term for specific ends. And so that's why in this week's lesson, I've attached a vocabulary sheet, which I want you to review the different perspectives on neoliberalism that I put on there. I'm not going to read them because you can read them to yourself and dissect them and think about what it means to you. But I really want you to think about how you understand neoliberalism after reviewing those definitions that I've provided as an ideology, as a political system, and as an economic system after reading the definitions. Because neoliberalism is an encompassing term that is a lot of the time overused and underexplained. So while you're thinking about that definition of those definitions of neoliberalism, what they mean to those different scholars, I want you to consider your own perspectives on neoliberalism and who you agree with more in the description and how they describe it. So remember that you need to write a discussion board post in response to this mini lecture. And a good idea for your discussion board post is to respond to that last question that I posed to you, thinking about neoliberalism and how you feel about it, how you feel about the definitions of it, whether you think it is as overarching of a concept as it is utilized as. You also might want to discuss whether you agreed with Piketty's conclusions from the TED Talk or if you agreed more with Gates' conclusions and critiques that I briefly discussed in this lecture about his lack of considering consumption, his lack of considering the decay of wealth, or any critiques that you even have after listening to it. You also might think about your own life experiences in relation to capital accumulation or lack thereof. Think about which of your friends or family members have had the most success when it comes to wealth accumulation and who hasn't. What characteristics or qualities those people have, what their family histories are. Those are all things that you can think about when writing your discussion board post, and of course anything that I haven't mentioned but that you're particularly interested in when it comes to discussing capital, capitalism, and wealth inequality. So I hope that you're having a good Monday. Don't forget to take the monstrous quiz and also do the discussion board post. And I will see you in a bit.